Hey, what's going on, guys? Jake Verdon Tech here, and today we're going to be talking about how you can increase your FPS on any title that you're playing. So this video is going to be geared towards more beginners more than anything. My power users, this is probably not any news to you on how to increase your FPS, and more specifically, increasing the FPS inside of each game that you're playing. So we're not going to be touching any types of overclocks on the graphics card, CPU. We're not going to be touching the RAM or any sort of hardware. This is all improvements on FPS that you can make just inside of the actual game settings that you're playing. So even though that the PC parts market is still kind of in the toilet, there are still a lot of people that I'm seeing in my comments and stuff that are just getting new systems, whether it's a pre-built desktop, a lot of laptops and stuff like that. So this video is kind of geared towards you guys, especially if you're coming from a console where you don't have as many settings in each title that you're playing to mess with. On a console, you have a lot more freedom and adjustments you can make being on PC. Now, a lot of the video settings that you see inside of the titles that you're playing might look kind of strange and you might not know exactly what those settings do. We're going to go over a couple. I'm not going to get super in depth into every setting you're going to see, but this is going to kind of give you a general idea of what I like to do on games when I first install them, because a lot of times when you first install a title, there's a lot of, I would say, fluff when it comes to the graphics settings. Your settings are typically going to start off on high, and then there's going to be a lot of extra things that I don't feel that you necessarily need, and a lot of those settings can actually hurt your FPS in game. So this can be kind of subjective too, because there may be settings that I don't personally like but others may like. Like for instance, I usually never enable any type of motion blur. I don't like the look of it, and a lot of times it will affect your FPS negatively. In the case of this video, we're going to be speaking in terms of competitive titles where users are looking to get the most amount of FPS possible. So those are the settings we're really going to aim towards. So what we're going to do in this video, guys, is I have a selection of 3 modern day competitive titles that I feel like are pretty decently rounded. I'm sure there's some more I could add to it, but probably some of the most popular titles out there, that being Call of Duty Warzone, Valorant, and Rocket League. They're very competitive titles, and most users that are playing these titles are looking to get the most amount of FPS possible. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to be doing a test where we run the default video settings when you first install the game. And from there, we're going to get an average FPS and see how the default settings are. Then we're going to go in and change some settings to where I think it might improve our FPS. Then we're going to get an average FPS once I change some of the graphic settings in each game and see how it weighs against the default settings when you first install the game. Alrighty guys, with that out of the way, let's get started. Alrighty guys, that's going to conclude the testing. So now we're just going to kind of go over each title and some of the results we got. Starting off talking about Call of Duty Warzone, there is a lot of settings in Warzone that you can tweak to adjust the graphics of the game and adjust your performance overall. I think I found that the render resolution is probably the biggest setting, which is going to increase or decrease your FPS. And unfortunately, when you first install the game, it's actually set to 0, the lowest rendering FPS. But in order for you to adjust it to the amount of pixels of your monitor, you're going to have to tweak it up some. So render resolution really depends on the type of panel you're trying to game on. In my case, I was running my 3440 by 1440p ultra wide panel. So that's a little bit more pixels to push than 1080p. And in order for me to get a more clear image, I would have to bump up the render resolution. So I did bump it up to 3440 by 1440, and we got a really good clear image. But unfortunately, when we're pushing those pixels a little bit further and adding pixels from the game settings, it does decrease our FPS a little bit. So that's a number you can definitely play with. I did have it all the way off and I got really high FPS, but unfortunately when I did that, the graphics quality was really poor, and it was kind of tough in a competitive scenario to see certain things and see certain enemies. So I don't think I would recommend doing that, but I would probably tweak it a little bit. Right now I have it at the full native resolution of my monitor, but I found I could game on it pretty well if I dialed it down to around 70, and I still had a decently clear image. Not as clear as the native resolution, but it was still pretty clear, and we got much higher frame rates. So if you guys are just getting a system, you install Warzone and you do have a little bit different monitor, you're not just running a 16:9 1080p panel, and you're maybe running like ultra wide like me, you will probably notice as soon as you get into the game that the graphics quality isn't real good. That's going to be that render resolution setting, so make sure you tweak that to where you like it. As far as going from the default settings to the tweaks, keeping the render resolution at native, we were able to gain about 15 FPS on average. So with the default settings, I noticed most of my gameplay was around 85 or so. And then once we tweaked everything down a little bit to the normal tweaks that I like to make, going from a lot of settings from high to normal, turning tessellations down a little bit, turning them down to like near, certain things like that, we were able to get about a 15 FPS average increase. So we were seeing FPS more commonly around the 100 mark and a little bit over. So moving over to Valorant, and Valorant is a title that I have almost no experience with until making this video. I haven't messed with it any, and as I kind of expected, it is a very well optimized title. The FPS is good. We have a lot of smooth textures in game, which definitely helps FPS performance. But going over some of their settings, which is very basic, which I really like. There's not a whole lot of tweaks like Call of Duty Warzone. But right off the bat with the default settings, we were hovering around 200 for the most part. And when we did make some graphics tweaks, turning a lot of these settings from high down to the lower settings, we did get about a 30 FPS increase on average. So most of the time I would see around 230 or so. And going with my basic rule of thumb, by turning off some of the graphically fluffy settings, which I like to call them, we turned off things like bloom, distortion, motion blur, all those types of settings in Valorant, and that also, I believe, helped get us that 30 FPS increase. So the last title we ran was Rocket League, which, like Valorant, it's not a very graphically demanding title, but it's still one where we can try to get the most amount of FPS possible. So by default, at least when I installed Rocket League on my system, it did have a 100 FPS limit on it using VSync, and I think that's because it picked up that I was running a 100 Hertz monitor, so it tries to match that. So before adjusting some of the settings, the FPS was around 100, and then I just turned off VSync and we got around 200 FPS or so. Then from there, I turned a lot of the settings down to performance mode. I think that's their, instead of having low, they call it performance, where you get more FPS. So I turned all of our settings down to performance, and we did see a pretty significant FPS increase. We were getting more around 240 or so. Alrighty guys, that's going to wrap up this video. I really wanted to make this video just to kind of give the beginners out there to the PC gaming world a little bit of insight on maybe some settings that they could adjust in game to get more FPS. So PC is quite a bit different than console, because anytime when I play console, usually I'll install the game, maybe adjust the gamma, and that's it, and start playing. But you have a lot more adjustments and freedom in PC for each game that you play. So it's almost never that I install a game and start gaming on it immediately. Usually I go to that video settings menu right off the bat, make some adjustments, and then start gaming. So I really just wanted to give you guys a basic rule of thumb that I go off of to adjust these games to get the most amount of FPS possible. And like I keep saying, it's kind of the fluff settings in the graphics tab of each game. So I try to eliminate some of those, and usually I do get a positive FPS increase. So generally, if I'm playing a more competitive title where I want more FPS, I will turn down the graphics settings from the default high, and I'll go down to a normal or low, whatever the game might have in store. I'll turn off a lot of the other fluff settings like I've mentioned, that being motion blur, distortion, turn down the shadows a little bit. Stuff like that does impact the system utilization, and when you turn those down, you usually will get a positive FPS increase. So that's it for this video, guys. Thank you for watching. If you guys found this video helpful, make sure to drop a like on it, and leave in the comments below if you guys have a setting that you run that helps increase FPS on some of the more competitive titles that you play. Thanks a bunch for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.